I'm really pleased that we've got Bilal Ghafoor joining us today. Bilal is a well-respected practitioner of information rights in the public sector, and the last time you and I met, Bilal was in Brussels, bizarrely, of all places, and we were sat next to each other in an EU conference on subject access rights. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And you were immaculately dressed with a bow tie and a suit, and I was really, really scruffy, which is why I made an effort today to put a shirt on. And I'm waiting for you sort of dress down, so it's nice.
Yeah, I'm dressed down, mate. I'm 12 months into lockdown, so I'm not wearing, I'm wearing shorts underneath this, and I've got a dog somewhere and a small child, so don't worry at all. I'm actually embracing the modern world at 57. Well, thanks very much for joining us, Bilal. And what have you been up to at the moment? What are you up to? And where are you? Because you just said it's 24 degrees C.
It is 24 degrees. I'm in Pakistan. I'm in Lahore, the second biggest city in Pakistan. I moved here because of the pandemic, because I have in-laws who are older and need looking after, and they randomly keep shutting airports down, so we can't get to them if we suddenly need to. So I'm now sitting here in 24 degrees centigrade, although don't be too jealous, because in about a month and a half it will become 40 degrees, at which point we won't be able to breathe at all. So there's a window of it being nice. Yeah, no, I'm extremely pleased to join DPAS. FOI was my first love. I was at the Department of Health as it was then, didn't do social care, and I noticed the people sitting next to me were having more fun. And so I joined their team. It turned out to be the FOI team, which then led me into data protection. I've always tried to keep my hand in FOI and keep doing it for public authorities. So this has always been my sort of first passion, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to just be speaking about it.
Cool and excellent. And I understand that you're going to do some training next year. You're taking over the training on behalf of the DPAS group for FOI and EIR.
I am indeed. I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah, so I'm in the middle of writing some of it. Some of it's already been written. It should be really interesting.
And that's the BCS course, is that right?
The British Computer Society course, and we're going to do an advanced practitioners course, which will be really tough. I hope, and also I think we're going to start off a foundation course in a day, which should give people the basics.
Cool. Okay, so the whole purpose of today really is to introduce the current notions of what's happening in the FOI and EIR world. Also, we're going to talk about certain topics like vexed data requests and responses and what's happening in that world. And certainly then move on to any other live issues. And we've got a couple of questions in early, so this is going to be a bit of a Q&A if you're happy with that.
Sure.
I was browsing on the BBC website and the Guardian website this week, and I saw that the national newspapers had approached the Cabinet Office and the Department Culture and Media Sport Select Committee over the Open Democracy report on the Cabinet Clearinghouse and how central government in the UK is actually nullifying FOI responses. And I think the word used by the Open Democracy Unit was that the central government are using an Orwellian approach to FOI requests. What's that all about?
So yeah, this is a really interesting thing. It's been kind of an open secret, but I think this is the first time that it's really kind of hit mainstream newspapers. Central government has been running a unit, and it's been doing it for about 15-20 years, so it's absolutely not new, where if you get requests which appear to be round robins or from journalists, then you share them. So you send them off to a mailing list, and back in the old days when FOI was under the Ministry of Justice, but now the Cabinet Office would give you handling advice. So there are kind of two really interesting problems around this. The first one is, what does this do to transparency? And then, of course, the second question is, what are the data protection problems with this? So the thing that's, I think, not been spoken about very much is the data protection issues. I think John Baines wrote something online about this. In fact, the last time I was on this round robin list is when I worked at Ofwat, the water regulator. And I think it was a few days before I left, I sent an email saying, I don't really understand what the processing conditions are, what the lawful basis is under the Data Protection Act. So this is a long time ago, and the same holds true now, as to how you can share the names of these requesters. but people were sharing them. I was told off for sending an inappropriate email. I didn't really see how it was inappropriate at all. And those same concerns remain. If you want to share details of requesters with other organizations, you need to have a processing. You need to have a lawful basis to do this. You need to be transparent about this. You need to tell requesters that this is what you're doing. And I think there's something that we can all learn from this. So aside from, of course, the transparency issues, if you are the kind of organization that is routinely having to send your FOI responses off to the legal team, if you're working, for example, in the council, there have been instances I'm aware of where councillors want to see responses and vet them before they go out. If you're having to send them off to the press team, etc. Look, are all of these necessary for handling the FOI request? I'd argue they probably weren't. Who needs to see the FOI request? Well, some organizations are very, very good. They anonymize, they get the request and they anonymize the request, and then they send it out to the relevant team and ask them to provide them with information. So no one really knows who the requester is except for the FOI team itself, and that's probably a very, very good approach. Most places don't do that. And so names get shared and spread. We're constantly having to get clearance, not just from the information asset owner or the person whose team owns and holds the information. They're actually trying to get clearance from all these other people who are in some way trying to amend the request, or it's an open secret that if a request comes in from a big national newspaper or the BBC, something like that, then the request is taken a hell of a lot more seriously. Not all organizations do this, but some absolutely do. I also noticed the government sort of pushed back on the Open Democracy report, and one of the things they said is that we don't share personal information about journalists, but they certainly did a few years ago, and I don't really see how they're not doing this now. So I would be amazed. Now, one of the interesting things that could happen, of course, is if you have local journalists and they put a subject access request in saying, so where did you share my name? You'd have to start telling them. And then all those problems around transparency, around your lack of lawful basis might well come up. So
and also the common law duty of confidentiality, which most people forget as well. And I think so but there's nothing wrong, is there, with central government having a clearinghouse in terms of per se for FOIs? It makes common sense. If there's because the government have pushed back this week and said it's about consistency of argument. It's no different than a local authority having a central repository to collect all FOIs and then manage them from central function, because we all know the challenges. I've worked in 10 local authorities, and we all know the challenge of sending an FOI request out to a department, and 4 weeks later it's finally opened and people say, well, when did you send me this? So there's nothing wrong with that approach, is there?
No, I agree, and that's fine. Again, so long as you're transparent about it, so long as you're telling people what you're doing, then that's perfectly fine. I mean, part of the problem is the Cabinet Office is saying that we don't direct people on how to answer requests. Well, so I've not worked in central government for a while. I think it's been about 10 years. But 10 years ago, you would get advice emails from, as was then, the Ministry of Justice saying, no, this is how you must respond to this. So there were many, many cases where I was going to send out a reply or use a certain exemption, and then I would simply send a template response, which was usually to not send the answer out, telling me how this should be done. So is the government response to this correct and accurate right now? It may well be if things have changed in the last 10 years, but I would be amazed if people were actually, if people had changed things. So I think the really big lesson is literally to make sure that whatever you're doing with journalists' names, that you're transparent about it, or that you're amazingly good at hiding it.
Yeah, I think, Bilal, certainly from the press's view, that there was with the current government with an 80 majority, that there would be a dilution of the openness and transparency. And we've only got to look at 2010, the words of Tony Blair in his memoirs. Tony Blair's government of 1998 introduced the Freedom of Information Act in 2000 with a view of openness and transparency. And by 2010, Tony Blair was using the words, you idiot, you naive, foolish, irresponsible nincompoop. There is really no description of stupidity no matter how vivid that is adequate, I quake at the imbecility of it, referencing his enactment of the Freedom of Information Act. So it's quite clear that when politicians do come to power, they might speak a lot about openness and transparency, but when it actually comes to actually delivering it and being open and transparent, that there might be challenges of it. So I can understand why the press might want to smell a rat as such. But let's move on to the next hot topic. And it certainly feels that, like so many organisations and companies, are being challenged to whether they're subject to the EIR. Now, we might have a couple of people on the webinar today that don't quite understand what the environmental information regulations are and how they sit aside the FOIs. But certainly, there's been a recent case involving E.ON, private sector companies, and also now Heathrow Airport, that the Information Commissioner has ruled in scope for the EIR. So what's your take on that, Bilal?
Yeah, so this is an ongoing argument. At one point, it was thought that very few, that it was core organisations that were pretty much subject to FOI were the only ones subject to EIR.
Public authorities, yeah, public authorities.
Yeah, so mostly public authorities. And then there started to become disputes. So EIR is all about environmental information regulations. It is about stuff that affects the environment. So it's things like gas emissions, the nature of the quality of air, the quality of soil, these kinds of things, biohazards. These are the things that really affect directly the environment. There is a list. The ICO guidance on this is very, very, very helpful. You can go and have a look at the environmental information regulations. It's something really, really good to keep in mind. Quite often, you go and read you go and read decision notices and discover that something that was handled as an FOI should have been handled as an EIR. But the two regimes sit parallel to each other. They're reasonably similar when it comes to kind of most straightforward basic cases. Sometimes even the Information Commissioner gets it wrong as to what is an EIR and what is an FOI. But there are these challenges now. So you have E.ON. Last year you had Heathrow Airports Limited being challenged. The Information Commissioner ruled that they are public authorities for the purposes of EIR. They are subject. And what is it that made them subject? Well, they seem, to boil it down, a couple of crucial things. The first one is that they have a public function. And so airports are deemed to have a public function. They're part of national infrastructure. They are an incredibly important service provider. The second thing is that they have a special power. So these special powers are what the cases usually end up turning on. So the special powers were usually things like the ability to compulsorily purchase land or to enter private property. So the ICO's decision notice in relation to Heathrow Airports Limited, which of course we must remember doesn't just own Heathrow Airport, runs many other airports as well, said that yes, this did have a public function and that it did have statutory powers. Now, I didn't realize until I'd read this decision notice that apparently Heathrow Airport Limited, under extremely limited circumstances, can actually enter private property without someone's consent. So they can do this kind of stuff. They are responsible for fining airlines if there is too much noise pollution, etc. So these are all special powers that most organizations don't have. Most private organizations, so for example, your local supermarket doesn't have a special power. It cannot do these kinds of things that might infringe on people's rights, but Heathrow Airport Limited can. So apparently, in fact, Nigel was the one who told me that this had been appealed and that there is going to be an appeal heard sometime in spring. There's all Nigel updating me on this. But my personal opinion, I've read the decision notice, I can't really see how Heathrow Airport can win. But also similarly, there were other organizations that have been challenged. So last year, a housing association was challenged on whether it was subject to the environmental information regulations. And of course, the critical thing, of course, we know that housing authorities do a lot, they do fulfill public tasks, but they had no special powers. They couldn't do stuff like compulsorily purchase anything. They didn't have powers of entry, etc. And so therefore, essentially, they were deemed not to be. But these challenges do keep on cropping up. And I think probably the lesson from all of this is that if you're working in an organization and you're sort of relatively new to it, you know, if it's a power company, if it, you know, the water companies are all sorted now, but if it is something where it's a, you know, it's not just a commercial enterprise, it's probably worth going around to your legal team at some point with a bag of donuts, or nowadays, I'm not quite sure how you'd really do it through Zoom. I think you'd have to be very nice to them and ask them, do we have any special powers? And if they say, what on earth does that mean? You say things like, can we force people to sell their land? Can we enter people's premises?
Yeah, and Bilal, one of the interesting things about the Heathrow, and for all practitioners on the call here, one of the interesting things about the Heathrow, the ICO's decision was not only based upon it has special powers, but it was previously in the public sector. And that's why it derives from its that's why it derives its special powers. So not only does it fulfill a task which is in the public interest, i.e. providing an airport, but it was previously owned by the British Airports Authorities. Now, on a macro level, Heathrow is very big, but on a micro level, Exeter Airport is very small. But Exeter Airport was previously wholly owned, 100% owned by Devon County Council. And certainly talking, and we're based in the southwest. We're based in Exeter, and certainly speaking to my colleagues at Devon County Council, they're now running around doing exactly that bag of donuts conversation to say, blimey. So I think for practitioners on the call, whereby, for example, you are a public authority and you have licensed, you have sold, you have now moved on into the quasi-public sector, that the Heathrow case and the EON case, slightly different, but the Heathrow case is really important because it's going to first level tribunal. So Heathrow and EON have appealed. It's going to first level tribunal in the spring. I did have the date actually, but because I wrote to the court service, and it'll be quite interesting. Now this has got legs, because I'm absolutely sure whoever wins in the first level tribunal will appeal to the upper tribunal, which therefore then we start to get a binding result on their status. So this has got a couple of years legs, no action required just yet. But as Bilal quite rightly says, that it's something that you might want to have a clear look at. And if you have outsourced or sold off elements of activity which was previously under the remit of the public authority, then they could be in scope for environmental information regulations. Now, what does that mean? Well, certainly in airports, you know, but remember, as Bilal said about environmental information regulations, they mirror FOI. If you get a request under EIR, then the challenges are different. The cost structure of responding is different. And certainly under EIR, the spread of request of information can go from anything from your electric vehicle emissions to policies, procedures, strategy, plans, and also health and safety issues as well. So the EIR is quite a broad piece of regulation sitting alongside FOI, very similar but not the same. And I think that this one is something we might pick up in 6 months' time, Bilal, to see where we are, because whoever wins first tribunal will appeal to upper tribunal without doubt, because I'm sure the ICO would want to maintain their position on what is a public authority and not under the legislation. I'm conscious of time, and we've got some questions that we've got sent in. I've also seen recently in the press that there's some press given to whether non-UK nationals can make FOI requests. What's that about? What's the background? Because I'm not a favour with the details there.
Yeah, so Computer Weekly, which is not something I read very regularly, so somebody must have put me onto this. I read that the whole load of cases had been stayed because it appeared that the requesters were either overseas or they were non-UK nationals. And so people were sort of sitting there.
So when you say non-UK national, does that mean people not based in the UK, or people who are based in the UK but not UK nationals? No?
So most of these were, as I recall, I think one was South African, one was from Hong Kong. These were journalists, and it was quite clear to the public authority that they weren't, but it was actually the tribunal that stayed all the cases, because someone there procedurally asked, can our judgment cover people who are, can we provide justice for people who are not resident in the UK or non-UK nationals? it seemed a really, really strange thing to say, because I think one thing that we're kind of always taught and spoon-fed right from the beginning with FOI is FOI is applicant blind. I mean, we know this is not entirely true, because when it comes to personal data or vexatious cases or aggregating repeat requests, etc., we know that it's not truly applicant blind, but to a great extent it should be. And so this idea had never really come up very seriously. So a judgment has come out, although the reasons have yet to be published. It would become really, really difficult to actually start asking people their nationality and establishing where they were from. In fact, bizarrely, the Isle of Man FOI Act, which I think is about 3 or 4 years old, specifically says you have to be an you have to be an Isle of Man resident, and when you make your request, you actually have to prove that you live there. Now, this is something, of course, we're very far away from. It'd be very, very bizarre if people started putting requests in, and by return, you sort of got a note asking for a copy of your passport or proof that you were resident. This would just become an absolute nightmare for, I think, everyone concerned. So I think we're very, very glad that this is not so. But it has been reaffirmed that actually, yes, no, it doesn't really matter who the request comes in from. You should just handle it. But a whole load of cases had got stayed. So if you ever come across the first half of the story where all these cases have been stayed, do try and find the second half of the story, or just take our word for it. Yes, FOI remains applicant blind, and you can't sit down and start refusing requests on this basis.
Cool. Thank you, Bilal, because what I don't want practitioners to go away today and say, well, actually, send me your passport details before I process your FOI. Because the whole idea of FOI or EIR is about openness and transparency in government, isn't it? In public authorities and decision making. Yeah, cool. Vexatious responses and vexatious requests are always interesting. I've just ran the last FOI training course, practitioners course, the BCS practitioners course, and it was quite interesting that a lot of the cohort there were from Devon County Council, which is great, because one of the great cases which went to upper tribunal was the Dransfield case, Dransfield versus Devon County Council, and a long-running case which went ICO, first level tribunal, upper tribunal, and went court of appeal, I think, at the end, and became a formative case within that. So it's been a few years since Dransfield decision, and the ICO has got some very good guidance on vexatious. In your opinion, Bilal, and your experience in the last sort of 2 years, 12 months, are public authorities more confident in using this under FOI and EIR vexatious, or?
I think it's such a mixed bag. I mean, Section 14, so deeming something vexatious or under EIR manifestly unreasonable, it's actually quite difficult, because the amount of evidence you need to gather to make your case is really, really, really time consuming. I mean, to be honest with you, when I've worked in FOI and EIR, what's happened is that people have kind of known that a certain person is just draining lots and lots of resource, a huge amount of time is fixated on something, and we kind of anecdotally know this. So what would happen is what I would do is I would clear half a day every single month, and I would sit down and I'd go, right, who's causing everyone the most problem in the last few months? And then we would come to some consensus sort of verbally, and I would sit down and I'd start digging in. Now, sometimes I'd dig in and go, oh, do you know what? I can see that these are really challenging. I can see that some of their language is not terribly pleasant. I can see that there are lots and lots of these requests. I can see all of this stuff, but actually it doesn't really form. I don't really think we have enough evidence to say this is vexatious. Sometimes I would go, oh no, come on, this is like really, really, really straightforward. This is like an open and shut case, but let's now start finding the evidence. Going through someone's previous 30, 50, sometimes 100 cases, looking at, tabulating them to see what is a repeat request, putting all the dates in, seeing how many internal reviews there are, etc., etc. It's hugely time consuming. And sometimes when you have that request on your desk, it's just quicker to answer it, because you can get it off your desk in, say, 2 or 3 hours sometimes, or if you can't, what actually happens is that the poor policy team, or the other relevant business area that actually holds the information, they're the ones that have to do all the work. When it comes to deeming something vexatious, manifestly unreasonable, you've got to do all of the work as the FOI team, as the FOI practitioner. It's a really tough ask to say to someone, look, clear half a day a month, or even sometimes a whole day a month, just to deal with this one case. But in the long term, it's probably quite a useful thing to do. What I really wanted to do was sort of talk through the level of evidence, because that's what all of this turns on. If you can find the correct evidence, you can make this work. And I really wanted to talk through a judgment. Now, in this judgment, when you sort of glance at the facts, somebody had made sort of 15, 20 requests. The public authority had put 370 hours into answering them. Every single request spawned an internal review or more questions. Some of the language being used was quite challenging. You know, the person started accusing the public authority of being, the staff of being dishonest, or started writing to ICO saying you're being incompetent. So, you know, on the face of it, this sounds like a pretty good case. You know, everything turns on the detail. But I personally would have looked at this and went, oh yeah, this sounds like a good candidate. Let's have a dig, because I think maybe this can be vexatious. This is clearly causing us a bit of a problem. But it all went wrong. And why it went wrong is something I think we can all learn from. I think we need to keep learning about vexatiousness, so that we're confident enough to start using it. If we understand where things go wrong, then we can make stuff go right. And I think you don't want to be using it all the time. You want to be using it at the appropriate time, but it's an incredibly powerful tool to use. So,
and what case was that, Bilal? What was the first?
So, I think we could probably email this out to anyone who wants to know, but it was EA/2109/0286. It was Mr. Conway versus the ICO.
Yeah.
Okay, so the case revolves around some information held by the UK Research Institute, which is a research council that distributes UK research funds. It works with the Medical Research Council, various other bodies. So Mr. Conway himself has a disability, which is relevant to this, but he's also the CEO of a campaign group around children and mental health and mental illness. So what was the beef about? Well, Mr. Conway wanted to know why a specific illness, which doesn't affect as many people as other illnesses, is being prioritized for research funds. Okay, the ICO agrees that there were 14 FOIs, all multi-part, and that there were some overlaps, and every single FOI request seemed to engender a new FOI request. UKRI says it spent over 350 hours dealing with them, which is a huge amount of time. That's 10 weeks solid of one individual's time if we're doing a 45-hour week. So imagine saying to somebody on your team, or if you don't have a team yourself, saying, right, everyone, let's just stop everything. For 10 weeks, you're just doing this one thing, and we're not handling any other requests, doing nothing else. That's a huge amount of time. So it sounds like, okay, this is a really good candidate. This sounds really, really burdensome. When the ICO looked at this, they said there was no wider public interest in the requests to know why research money was being spent on a disease that didn't affect so many people. So it sounds like an open and shut case. Right. The tribunal looked at this. And the tribunal says that there were 4 issues. And this is the kind of stuff where you need to start thinking about evidence. It says, think about the burden on the public authority. Think about the motive of the requester, whether the request itself has any value, and if there's any harassment or distress on staff. So, burden, value.
Repeat those 4 things so people can get them down, because they're really important. Yep.
Yeah. So it's burden, the motive of the requester, the value of the requests, and any harassment or distress experienced by the staff.
And Bilal, just to take back on the burden is really important, because and going back as far as the 1984 Data Protection Act, the whole intention of the legislation was to follow the 1981 convention in terms of giving people, for example, their subject access requests. But certainly, if you read the mind of the legislators, and if you read Hansard, it is quite clear that it's a balance. So, for example, privacy rights are a balance between the rights of the individual and the public interest in receiving information, but also the burden on, in that time, the data controller in being able to supply that information. And certainly if you read the parliamentary debates in Hansard about FOI, it was clearly that it wasn't meant to be an undue burden on public authorities, and that's why, for example, in FOI we have the 18 hours rule under the fees regulations, and also EIR, although charging regime is slightly different. We have that burden on the public authority being somewhat a balance to. So don't be scared of using the burden argument if you can, as Bilal quite rightly says, though, demonstrate evidence and demonstrate compliance. Bilal, sorry, back to you.
No, I agree. Evidence is king here. Nothing works without evidence, and this whole thing unraveled because, although on the face of it seems like an open and shut case, there was not enough evidence. So the second thing is the motive of the requester. Are they just being difficult? Are they trying to harass you? Are they trying to keep open a case, an issue that has been resolved? Now, getting into the motive of the requester has always been a bit difficult because this requires guesswork. So I've always thought that was the single most difficult bit, and you have to tread quite carefully here, because you can, the moment you impute any motive on the requester that the requester can just deny, well, the requester knows their own mind better than you do, so you end up on a hiding to nothing. But sometimes requesters have actually, I've come across requests where requesters have actually obliged me by writing in and saying, I'm only making this FOI request to annoy you. And you think, oh, well, that's great. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
But that's kind of quite rare, it has to be said. Okay, the value of the request. Now, the ICO says that there was no real wider public interest in it. Now, if you recall Mr. Dransfield case, that was all about provision to prevent lightning strikes to schools, which kind of sounds like there's quite a lot of value in this. Now, you've got to work out what is the wider public interest in the request. Does this matter to other people? Is there something? Now, in this case, if we're asking where is the leading and most important research council putting its money into mental health research, then I think we all kind of want to know. Like, today I haven't spent any time today wondering about mental health research. But if someone said to me, do you want to know the reason in a minute? I'd go, yeah, definitely, just tell me, because that sounds really, really important. Like, I can't see how it doesn't. The fourth element was harassment or distress of the staff. And again, there's something quite interesting going on in this case. So let's have a look at what went wrong on burden. So 350 hours they said over 350 hours we spent, and then it said, then they said actually at the table we spent 370 hours dealing with these requests.
Wow. Yeah.
Right. Where did it all go wrong? Well, it all kind of went wrong because they failed to have any evidence. So they'd written down a number. The ICO had looked at it and went, yeah, that sounds reasonable. But there was literally no breakdown or evidence of this of any kind. So when I'm trying to use burden, now sometimes you have one request which is so disproportionately huge. I've had requests where we worked out it would probably take 10,000 hours to answer it. You're kind of quite lucky because you think, well, this is clearly disproportionate. But when you're trying to find a pattern where it's 350 hours, you have to be able to say something about why. Now, nobody keeps a log. When an FOI request comes in, no one keeps a log of how long each bit took. But it's always worth going and spending some time with the team, asking them, when the second or third request comes in, and you think, oh, this is looking like a bit of a pattern. Just to do simple things like ask them, when you're working on this request, stick the time into your diary. It takes 10 seconds to just book a couple of hours in the diary, and that then just sits there, and then a year later, 2 years later, this becomes evidence. So that kind of thing is incredibly useful. Now,
Bilal,
go on.
Bilal, And that's particularly important during the current coronavirus, isn't it? Because a lot of public authorities are doing other things. You know, we have a number of local authorities we look after in terms of providing them consultancy report, and a lot of their staff are repurposed at the current time because they're helping vulnerable members of the community and doing actions about people who are shielding and making sure that they're well, etc. So you know, that burden during vexatious during a period of national emergency as such is really important. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, I absolutely agree. And during the time of crisis or change, in fact, if anyone attends the course, I will actually, we don't have time right now, but I will tell you about how I shut down 800 cases as being burdensome, and I did this in 2 weeks. Because this was a point at which primary care trusts. No. I expect everyone to reply. It was really straightforward. Primary care trusts were being abolished. All the staff had left the PCTs and were being transferred to new units. There was no staff. I was hired by 9 PCTs to go and shut all their cases down, which I did. Now that doesn't happen very often, but you can do it. So yeah, a time of change and crisis is absolutely something that you should take into account. Now, what were the other problems with burden? Well, it turned out that most of the correspondence was constructive. It also turned out that although the requests were actually months apart, so it wasn't as if there was a mad flurry of requests all in one day, although there was one instance where there were a few requests over a short period of time. Actually, this didn't form this pattern. So when it came to burden, yes, it was 350 hours, but it was over quite a long time. Motive and value. Well, we've already discussed how I think this has intrinsic value. Conway himself, the requester, had given evidence to select committees on mental health funding. And so this wasn't malice. This was about looking at the issues. However, it turns out that some of his language was becoming more obsessive around the conduct of the public authority and the ICO, so that he'd started being a bit mean. But when it came to harassment and distress, well, he kind of said this answer's rubbish, this answer's terrible, you know, this is ill-judged. It wasn't judged. It wasn't a sort of an ad hominem attack. It wasn't an attack on a specific individual that was particularly harsh. I think people would just look at it and go, okay, fine, and move on. You know, I've seen the spectrum of really unpleasant correspondence, and this just did not fit it. So the tribunal did warn him and say, well, you know, your language and your attitude is kind of drifting, and this could become more vexatious. Of course, the other really interesting thing was that his language had become worse after the internal review. So he had become really, really angry and just quite bitter and unpleasant after the internal review, once it had gone to the ICO. But the decision on vexatiousness should be taken at the point of the internal review. So all the stuff he did after that didn't count. So none of that was taken in evidence.
And so for practitioners then, because I'm keen, we've only got sort of 5 and 10 minutes left. So that the key for practitioners, lessons learned out of this recent case is be able to demonstrate compliance, have your time logs in place, and be able to have an audit trail to prove your vexatious claim against the individual. And remember as well, Bilal, that it really is about not only about the individual, but it's about the information requested, isn't it? So it's about judging it.
Yeah, and I think this just seems so inherently valuable. The bar here would have been incredibly high. So despite all the stuff going on, there wasn't really enough evidence, and this case failed. Although it made perfect sense to the ICO. So evidence as much as you can, and it's painful, it's really slow, it's painful, it's hard work, but in the long run, actually it often resets the relationship with the requester, who becomes either more reasonable or stops.
Yeah, and it's certainly in the current climate, it's really important that we focus limited public authorities' resources into the right areas, and if people are vexatious and putting responses in solely for the purpose of dare I say, burdening you, but not really with a clear justification, then I think we can be more proactive in that area. Good. That brings me on nicely, really, to how is FOI and EIR getting on in the coronavirus world? Because we're 12 months in now. The ICO have issued some recent helpful guidance, I see, and some support. Where are we at the moment in terms of that relationship?
So the ICO, I don't know if it was helpful or not. In March, the FOI team was kind of really pleased where I was working to note that the ICO had said we're going to be pragmatic about enforcement because we appreciate that everyone is diverting their resources elsewhere. Coronavirus has kind of subsumed everything, and we know certainly in the NHS, in local councils, just to name two of the kind of the biggest areas, pretty much it was all hands on deck. Every program got shut down, and it was all about support the community, stop the spread of the virus. So it was nice to hear they were pragmatic. I do recall that some of the business units were also rather delighted, but for the wrong reasons. They thought, oh, this just means that we don't really have to do anything for a few months. And so, yeah, they didn't really take this in the spirit in which this was intended. However, in July last year, the ICO published a toolkit to try and get people back on track. I have to say, one thing that came out, in fact, it was a tweet a little while ago, retweeted by the Campaign for Freedom of Information, said that Camden Council in the last 12 months had managed to get 99.1% of its requests out on time. So clearly it's possible. Camden is a huge council. It's an unwieldy beast. I'm sure that colleagues there are as nice, as helpful, as unhelpful, and as horrible as any other organization. It's not a nirvana of any kind. Somehow or the other, they've managed to do something, and there are lots and lots of strategies that can help improve compliance. But the ICO has published this toolkit, and what does this toolkit do? I was very excited. I clicked on the toolkit thinking this will help. It turns out it's 5 questions and a spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet essentially asks you what's going wrong, how badly wrong is it going, and what do you think the reasons are. Now, to be honest, I'm pretty sure everyone on this call that does FOI or EIR could probably in 5 minutes, with no further research or thought, tell me exactly what's going wrong in your public authorities. I don't think you really needed a spreadsheet to do this. Yes, some of the questions are slightly helpful, but I'm not entirely sure. I mean, if you're being ignored right now by senior leadership, then I'm not sure that the ICO spreadsheet will actually help you being taken seriously. So I'm not entirely convinced as to what the purpose of this is, except it's kind of useful to have a quick read just to see what kinds of questions they're asking and to include those in any updates that you might have for your line managers. There seems to be a huge backlog at the ICO. This ever was. They seem their caseworkers are, from what I can read around decision notices, they're really taking shortcuts. It's taking months and months and months. In fact, at one place, I was given all the new ICO cases, and 4 months later, not a single one had actually been given a reference number. So the great, wonderful expertise I was bringing to the case involved sending off a couple of emails and sitting back and then just handing them over when my contract came to an end, having not progressed any of them at all. So yeah, all of this is kind of quite unfortunate. Elizabeth Denham's contract has been extended a little bit. We're now all waiting once again with bated breath to find out who the new Information Commission will be and to pray that something will change. It becomes really difficult, I think, even for public authorities when the regulator sits on cases for months and months, because you lose so much memory of what happened, and not every single thing.
And Bilal, the fundamental of Freedom of Information Act is in the title, isn't it? Freedom of Information. It's us as taxpayers and residents' information. It's not that of the government. It's not that of the public authority, and it is not helping, certainly during the current climate, or whilst one understands the challenges on public authorities, that the whole idea of the legislation is about openness and transparency in decision making, and that so we'll understand it, but we'll also have an opportunity to challenge public authorities in decisions that are being made. So So by the Information Commissioner not being able, and I rarely knock the Information Commissioners, to be quite frank, because I've worked for two regulators, know how difficult their job is. I rarely knock it. But, you know, there was a case last week, for example, Bilal, which I saw about Virgin Media. Was it Virgin Media? I saw it's a GDPR data breach question, and whereby the response was a bit like a yes minister response. And you know, and they were talking about the numbers involved, so therefore we consider the numbers involved. There were 900,000 people who had their data breached, for an example. You know, and it was a fairly bland response, and even I got quite annoyed at that in terms of the ability of the Information Commissioner to really be open and transparent for that. And of course, when we don't have information, we fill a void. We make stories up, don't we? And then that's where the opportunity comes. And you know, and I'm a great proponent that FOI is a fantastic piece of legislation if public authorities use it properly, and also that those of us who use FOI, and I've used it in the past, use it on a proportional basis to seek information to enable our knowledge and the environment we live in and the circumstances we live in to be able to further that. Look, we've got one more question, and I think it's come in, and I just want to give it to you, Bilal, because we've got about 5 more minutes really. Is that following on from that, and following on from coronavirus, and following on from the pandemic, what do you see the future of FOI and environmental information? Certainly because I'm aware there's a new environmental bill, and will dare I say central government use it to stifle debate and information?
It's really difficult. Every single administration that's come in has tried to restrict things. I mean, we had Cameron's open government transparency agenda, a whole load of stuff got published, but I'm not convinced that FOI was particularly supported. I mean, one of the best ways of supporting things like FOI is just to make it private contractors working with public authorities subject, do basic things like that. I mean, that has its own problems, but that's how there's so much outsourcing going on. That's how it will be. EIR is under terrible attack. There is a new environmental bill, clause 42, establishes the Office of Environmental Protection and says that any organization it is investigating cannot release environmental information. The Cabinet Office is making all this noise and saying, no, it won't really be like that. But if you really think it won't be like that, why not just make it clear and explicit in the legislation? So these attacks are really, really insidious. It just becomes ever more difficult to really understand where things are going. And we know that central government enforcement is a bit of a joke. Cabinet Office seriously does not respond to requests, just pretty much ignores them. It takes ages to get through and put an internal review in, and then by the time you go to the ICO, as you said, it's not about being able to challenge what's happening now, because you might get your refusal or some information a year later. It's too late. Stuff has already happened. I think actually, whatever the legislation says, whatever happens, FOI and EIR is really actually in the hands of the people doing the practicing. What matters more is the attitude of all the people on this call, all the people who are doing this stuff, how helpful and good you are willing to be, how committed you are to transparency. That's where FOI really, really lies. Because you can take, I've worked in places where the same act, same legislation, same guidance leads to people not releasing anything and being incredibly unhelpful and just being annoying, and other places where people are incredibly open and transparent. Attitude maybe helps. Certainly central government's attitude, by and large, as far as we can see, is not a good one.
Bilal, thank you very much. Been very informative as always. Thank you very much. We are 5 minutes late, but I think it was very, very useful for that. For practitioners, and I will echo what Bilal has just said, that you're doing a great job. You're there to foster a spirit of open and transparency. within information rights, that whether it be environmental freedom of information or subject access rights, and clearly you have a challenge and a balance in terms of the public interest of your organisation and also what is requested. But you know, we must remember under EIR and FOI the default position is to release the information unless you have a very strong public interest reason for the reason why, and it's about justifying that. So thanks very much, Bilal, for updating us. Clearly, you're going to get off for your evening meal now. So it's what time is it now? It's
nearly 5 o'clock here
in Pakistan.
Tea and biscuits.
Tea and biscuits, and thank you very much. And we'll see you next month for your first FOI course, and good luck with that.
And good luck to everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Bye-bye.